happened to me back in 2002. I just needed a break, that's all. But the forest doesn't care about your reasons. The forest is indifferent. And the things that move in the dark, they're worse. I parked my car at the trailhead just before noon, slung my pack over my shoulders, and hiked around 30 minutes. By then, I picked a clearing near the river, set up my tent, and spent the afternoon exploring, feeling the tension ease from my muscles as I breathed in the crisp, pine-heavy air. I was alone, completely alone. No screaming neighbors, no honking cars, no suffocating crowds pressing in on me. Just me and the wild. By the time the sun started to sink, I knew I had to head back. I stood at a fork in the trail, staring down the shortcut, a narrow, overgrown path that cut through the trees directly to my campsite. It would save 20 minutes off my walk, but it was already shadowed, thick with tangled branches, and God knows what lurking beyond the dim glow of dusk. My gut twisted. No. Screw the shortcut. I turned onto the main path, longer but wide and open. That's when I heard something. The crunch of footsteps behind me. I froze, blood turning to ice. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe. But something felt wrong. The steps weren't erratic or light. They were measured. Deliberate. Human. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, quickening my pace. The footsteps did the same. Don't panic. Just keep walking. My fingers wrapped around the flashlight in my pocket, but I didn't turn it on yet. Not yet. My breath was loud in my ears, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I forced myself to glance back, casual, like I wasn't seconds away from bolting. And there he was. A tall figure, half hidden in the trees, moving with an eerie, unhurried confidence. Too big to be anything but a man. Too close to be a coincidence. I faced forward and walked faster. So did he. I pushed into a full sprint, but I knew it was a mistake. Running would mark me as prey, would awaken whatever primal instinct lurked inside the figure stalking me. My thoughts spun, grasping for options. My campsite wasn't far. If I could just reach it. His breathing, low and heavy, getting closer. I pulled the flashlight out and swung it behind me. He froze. Just a silhouette in the trees, but I saw him shift. I forced myself to speak, to make noise, to shatter the thick, suffocating silence. "Hey, you need something?" I called out. Nothing. He just stood there, a dark mass in the trees, watching me. I turned and walked faster, my skin crawling, my instincts screaming. My camp was close, almost there. I could see the faint glow of embers in the fire pit, the outline of my tent just beyond the trees. Then I had an idea, a desperate, last-ditch effort. I faked a laugh, loud and bright, like I wasn't alone, like I wasn't fucking terrified. "Hey, you got that food ready?" I called out, forcing my voice to sound casual, careless, like someone was waiting for me. "I'm starving." Silence. Then a soft, almost imperceptible shift. The shape in the trees hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough. And then, footsteps. Faint, retreating footsteps. I didn't breathe until I reached my tent, practically diving inside, zipping it up with shaking hands. My whole body was electric with panic, my nerves frayed to hell. The night dragged on, thick and suffocating with unease. But then I heard again. Soft, careful, footsteps circling my tent. I gripped my knife. I just sat there, paralyzed, listening as the slow, deliberate steps moved around my tent, circling, until they stopped. Right behind me. I didn't sleep. Not that night. Not really. When morning came, I saw that everything was completely silent. I stepped out of my tent cautiously and took a moment to survey my surroundings. And then I saw them. Footprints. Large, deep, circling my campsite, stopping right outside my tent flap. I broke camp in 10 minutes flat, packing with shaking hands, throwing my gear into my pack with no care for neatness. I just needed to get the hell out. As I hiked back to my car, when I finally reached the parking lot, the relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I threw my pack in the trunk, yanked open my car door, and slammed it shut with shaking hands. I was done. Never again. But it wasn't over. A week later, I saw a news report. A woman had been attacked brutally at a campsite not far from mine. The description of the suspect was vague, tall, broad, dark clothing, but I didn't need the details. I already knew. He was the same man, and I had been inches from becoming his prey. It was a miracle, pure luck, what else you could say. But I knew better. I knew it was just luck that nothing happened to me that night, and luck isn't something you can count on twice. That's why I stay away from places like that now, places that feel too empty. I went camping alone that day in the deep woods of Carolina. I'd done many times before without issue. I knew these forests well, knew how to navigate them, knew how to respect them. It started simple enough. I set up my tent near a clearing just before sundown, made a fire, and got my camera ready. Photography was my side gig, something I did when I wasn't stuck in an office. I liked capturing the way the light twisted through the branches, the way the mist settled over the ground in the early morning. But that evening, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. At first, I figured it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. A coyote. But when I turned, I saw her. A woman, standing about 30 yards away, barely visible through the trees. She was twisted slightly, one foot turned inward like she was nursing a bad injury. Her clothes looked old, shadowed, unreadable. I raised my camera, thinking maybe she was a lost hiker, someone who needed help. The second I lifted the lens, though, she ducked behind a tree. I lowered the camera. "Hey," I called out. "You okay?" Silence. Just the crackle of my fire behind me. I stepped forward, but she didn't reappear. I waited a few moments before shaking my head and heading back to camp. Probably some local who didn't want to deal with a stranger. Fair enough. I forced myself to ignore it and got back to work. Took a few pictures of the fire, the way the embers glowed against the darkening sky. But that feeling, it didn't leave. That prickle on the back of my neck, the awareness of something just beyond the edges of my vision. Then came the sound. A rustling in the undergrowth, a crunch of leaves. Heavy footfalls, slow and deliberate, circling just out of reach of the fire's light. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. And then she stepped out again. But this time, she was closer. Too close. The limp was more pronounced now. Her movements stiff and jerky, like she was unused to walking properly. She let out a low grunt, something guttural, something that didn't sound right coming from a human throat. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong with her. Then the wind shifted, and I saw it. Her hair was askew, hanging in patches. Her face was sunken, the skin pulled too tight, too pale. And worse, her clothes were different. I swear to God, they weren't the same ones she'd been wearing earlier ago. That's when I knew. She wasn't a woman at all. I don't know how I knew. Instinct, maybe. Some deep, primal part of me just understood that this thing, this person, wasn't what it seemed. My blood ran cold, my body locked up. And then she moved. Not towards me. Not at first. Instead, she started thrashing at the ground, clawing up handfuls of leaves and dirt, throwing them into the air like some kind of animal marking its territory. Grunts turned into laughter high, manic giggles that didn't match the face, didn't match the body. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. 1 second she was standing there, the next she'd melted into the shadows. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it towards the woods. Nothing. Just trees and darkness and that unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, my pulse hammering, and nearly tripped over my own fire. My tent was right there, my car just a 15-minute hike away. I should have left then. Packed up, bolted. But I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just some backwoods lunatic messing with me. Maybe he was on something. Meth heads weren't unheard of in these parts. I doused the fire, zipped up my tent, and sat inside with my knife gripped tight, waiting. Listening. Hours passed. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to something worse. Much worse. Breathing. Not mine. Not some distant sound carried by the wind. Right outside the tent. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around the handle of the knife. A soft, shuffling sound followed, slow movement, like something or someone was circling the tent. Then, the faintest whisper. You shouldn't be here. I swallowed bile. My hand trembled. I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged for the zipper, yanked it down, and burst out of the tent, blade in hand. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I swung the flashlight around wildly. Nothing. But the second I turned towards the trees, I saw him. Not the woman. Not anymore. A man now, or at least something wearing the shape of one. Taller than before, dressed differently. Standing at the tree line, grinning. The same manic grin I'd seen earlier. That was enough for me. I ran. Didn't bother packing. Didn't look back. Just sprinted for the car, and I swear I heard footsteps behind me, keeping pace, gaining. I reached the car. I didn't wait to see what it was. I peeled out of there so fast I nearly tore up my tires. Drove straight into town, parked in the lot of a 24-hour gas station, and sat there shaking until the sun came up. I went to the police, of course. Reported a strange person harassing campers in the woods. They took some notes, nodded, said they'd check it out, but I could tell they weren't taking me seriously. But I wasn't. Because before I left, as I was heading back to my car, one of the officers said something that made my stomach drop. We've had a couple of reports like this before. Always different descriptions, though. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But I'll tell you this. I'm never camping alone again. That weekend, my husband, David, had a 3-day business trip in Atlanta, and rather than sit around the house alone, I decided to take my 6-year-old daughter, Lily, on a 2-day camping trip in the deep woods of the Appalachian Trail. We'd been on plenty of hikes before, and I figured a little mother-daughter adventure would be good for both of us. Just a couple of days in the crisp mountain air, cooking over a fire. I checked the weather, packed emergency gear, and even let David know our location just in case. Everything was supposed to be safe, predictable. But that first night, something felt off. I brushed it away as nerves. Maybe the quiet was just a little too deep. Or maybe I wasn't used to being out here alone without another adult. I forced a laugh, told myself I was being ridiculous, and focused on enjoying the time with Lily. The second afternoon, we decided to take a short hike near our campsite. Lily ran ahead on the trail, giggling as she kicked up leaves. The further we went, the more I felt that prickling sensation again, the one that tells you something isn't right. I told myself it was just the isolation, but I started scanning the trees anyway, my instincts screaming at me to pay attention. And then I saw him. A man. He was standing just off the trail, partially hidden behind a thick tree trunk. A heavy-set man in a faded blue shirt. No backpack. No gear. He wasn't walking, just watching. My stomach clenched. I wasn't some Navi city girl. I knew what normal hikers looked like. They carried water. They had a purpose. This man didn't. And the way he kept his hands up, Miming the action of taking pictures despite holding no camera sent a wave of ice through my veins. I stopped in my tracks. Lily turned back to me, her little forehead scrunched in confusion. "Mom?" I smiled, calm, controlled. "Come here, sweetie." She skipped over, and I took her hand. The man hadn't moved. He just stood there, shifting slightly, half hidden behind the trees. My mind raced. There were no other campsites nearby, no other hikers we had seen in hours. He was alone. And yet, something told me he wasn't really alone at all. I pretended to adjust Lily's backpack, using the movement to subtly glance around. No obvious sign of a vehicle. No sounds of other people. But I knew better than to think he'd hiked in from nowhere. I glanced at the trees, the narrow slits of sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. There were too many places for someone to hide out here. Too many ways to vanish. The man shifted. He stepped sideways, like he thought I wouldn't notice. Still watching. My fingers tightened around Lily's hand. I had two choices: turn back the way we came, or keep going forward. If I turned back, he'd have the higher ground, an easy advantage. Forward was unknown, but at least I wasn't cornered. I kept walking. Slow, measured, like I wasn't afraid. I wasn't about to let this bastard think he had any control over the situation, but I could feel him moving, following, just outside of my direct vision. Hiding behind trees, shifting his weight like some deranged game of hide and seek. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I didn't stop. Then I did something that changed everything. I waved at him, a simple gesture. Just raised my free hand and gave him a little flick of the wrist, a move that said, "I see you." That's when he froze. He hadn't expected that. And then he turned and walked away. I didn't feel relief. Not yet. This wasn't over. I didn't speak to Lily, didn't explain. I just turned onto a different path, one barely noticeable, a shortcut I had spotted on the map earlier. I picked up the pace, not running but walking fast enough that Lily had to skip to keep up. By the time we reached the campsite, my hands were shaking. I packed up immediately, throwing everything haphazardly into bags, barely able to zip them up. My ears strained for any sound outside of Lily's small voice, asking what was wrong. We reached the car, and that's when I saw it. An old truck, parked near the entrance to the trail. It hadn't been there when we arrived. I didn't wait to analyze it, didn't stop to check if anyone was inside. I buckled Lily in, locked the doors, and peeled out of that parking lot. I arrived home safely. Nothing had happened to me. However, my instinct told me that something wasn't right. At that moment, I felt weird vibes about that person. That night, I told David everything. His response? He bought me a pocket knife later and told me I needed to carry something better than my bare hands. Because I knew, deep down, that man wasn't out there for fun. He wasn't just some lost hiker for sure.